Being with us, peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, held in Istanbul, ended barely an hour after they began this Monday, a day after a massive Ukrainian drone attack on Russia's nuclear-capable strategic bombers. That Ukrainian drone attack on the Russian nuclear aircraft, the most audacious strike yet by Kyiv's forces. It comes amid talk of NATO allies lifting strike restrictions, but it's believed that all this was basically a stealth hit carried out by Ukrainian weaponry smuggled to a closer position in order to strike. Some of the targets were some 4,000 kilometers from Ukraine. Now, the talks in Istanbul, the second such direct talks between the two in a fortnight, have already begun, began some 2 hours later than scheduled. There was no explanation for this, and that kind of set the tone. An exchange of prisoners was discussed and approved, but there's no word on the return of Ukrainian children snatched and taken to Russia, some 19,000 of them. And of course, over this issue, Vladimir Putin is under an international arrest warrant for war crimes. Well, the second round of direct talks then in just over a fortnight, Turkey once more playing host. But with Russia's massive weekend attack on Ukraine and then Ukraine's surprise strike on Russia's nuclear bombers, the scene wasn't set for progress. Antonia Kerrigan with this.
Talks in Istanbul showed glimmers of negotiation between Russia and Ukraine as the two sides agreed to exchange all seriously ill or wounded prisoners of war, those under 25, and the bodies of thousands of fallen soldiers. But as of yet, no sign of a ceasefire.
The Russian side continued to reject the notion of unconditional ceasefire, the very unconditional ceasefire that the American president himself offered a while ago, the very unconditional ceasefire that our delegation has offered once again.
But just 2 weeks after a previous round of talks failed to bear fruit, with the Russian side holding back their blueprint for peace, the delegations finally exchanged memoranda of understanding.
Since the Ukrainian side has been asking for a concrete ceasefire proposal, we've decided to offer a 2 to 3 day ceasefire in certain areas along the front line, the details of which we will discuss with the Ukrainian military.
Ukrainian negotiators said they could not respond to the Russian proposal immediately until they'd had the time to study it, but suggested a new round of talks in late June. Moscow's re-engaging in talks comes as Donald Trump has shown his patience with President Putin to be wearing thin, in which context the Russian delegation refused to have any American negotiators in the room.
Natia Kerrigan's report there. Let's bring in for a broader analysis Natia Seskuria, who is Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute and founder and Executive Director of the Regional Institute of Security Studies. Natia, as always, thanks for joining us here in France 24. We always appreciate your time. I'm wondering there whether, just at the end of our report, speaking there about Donald Trump and his change of tone towards Vladimir Putin, is that having an effect, or do you think that really it is still Putin who's holding the strings and working the puppets?
Thank you very much, first of all, for having me. It's great to be back on your show. I think we see some changes when it comes to his rhetoric. He's been much more critical towards Vladimir Putin, especially due to the fact that Russia has been relentlessly bombing Ukrainian infrastructure, cities, and civilians as well. So we see that Trump is becoming more skeptical about Russian intentions, although I have to mention that I think Trump is very unpredictable when it comes to his reactions on these ongoing developments. But one thing is clear, that he's getting much frustrated because, first of all, his promise was that he would end this war very soon after he would become the president. And so far, I mean, speaking straight after these negotiations ended today, we see that there is absolutely no clarity about any sort of timeline or any possibility to what extent this ceasefire or even peace deal can be achieved.
Indeed. I noticed on one of the social media platforms, Alexander Dugin, the man who's referred to as Putin's brain, the far-right Russian philosopher, making the cry, "Where is MAGA?" Basically trying to call out to Donald Trump to get more on Putin's side and try to end this war in their favour, of course. Volodymyr Zelensky, on his part, saying, well, Vladimir Putin can't decide whether or not Ukraine joins NATO. There are so many different aspects to what is going on right here, right now. Do you feel, Natia, that this talks process is stalled or it's actually finished? Do you think really basically getting together achieved nothing today apart from the agreement on the prisoner exchange, and that's that?
Well, I think at the beginning, Russians were much more optimistic. As you mentioned, there were some hopes that Trump would be more on Russia's side rather than Ukraine's side, and especially at the beginning when we saw the White House, the Oval Office meeting, there were some signs that things were not going well for Ukraine. But I think Ukraine has been quite smart in terms of shifting these dynamics, and now Russians are becoming more concerned. I did not have any hopes that we would get any tangible results from the negotiations. I think negotiations are stalled. And the main issue and problem here is that Russian demands are non-negotiable from the Russian standpoint. And I think there is still a way through which the United States can put pressure on Putin. And Trump has also hinted that he's considering some of these measures. However, we have to see whether or not these he will take the action when it comes to punishing Putin for his unwillingness to engage in these negotiations from a standpoint that anything tangible can be achieved out of this.
I must admit, though, Natia, maybe you share the same view that I have. At the beginning of today, I sense very little would happen, given what happened over the weekend with Russia's massive drone attack on Ukraine, its biggest so far, and then Ukraine's surprise hit on those Russian nuclear aircraft, which, of course, took the Russians completely by surprise. Is this a sign, do you think, that Ukraine in some way, shape or form is starting to find a different way of striking back at Russia in some way? And clearly, from the beginning, the numbers have always been against Ukraine.
Absolutely. I think this was an extremely bold and audacious operation, but also when it comes to the military, technical and logistical side of things, it's an incredibly difficult operation to pull off. And I think one thing that we can learn out of this is that this whole myth of Russian invincibility has been destroyed by Ukraine, and Putin's regime is already driven by a high degree of paranoia. And what this operation proves is that some of its most reliable intelligence and security services have completely failed to intercept this. And this, I think this is a huge humiliation for Putin, and this shifts the dynamic in favor of Ukraine. And I think this gives Kiev much needed morale boost, while Russians have been, as you mentioned, relentlessly bombing Ukrainian cities in the past couple of weeks. I do think that Kiev sends quite an important message with this spiderweb operation. Firstly to Russians and also to its slightly more skeptical allies that Ukraine can operate fully independently with its homegrown capability and use asymmetric methods that can make Russia pay for to a certain extent, at least, for the cost of its aggression.
And will this attack, do you think, Natia, change the narrative within Russia? Because clearly Vladimir Putin, via the propaganda network, is controlling what ordinary Russian citizens consume in terms of news about what's going on. Here we see something that is very different, a different type of Ukrainian strike, a different sense of target, and a sense of targeting anywhere in Russia. It really changes things, doesn't it?
Absolutely. We cannot underestimate the power of Russian propaganda, but I think it's very clear that this is quite an extraordinary effort from Ukrainians, and this brings the war into Russia. What we see so far is that Russian media has been trying to downplay the impact of this attack. They have framed, as it was expected, this attack as a terrorist act, but so far, I think it's without a doubt that this is quite an extraordinary development, even from the ordinary Russian citizens' perspective, who are, of course, well fed by the Russian propaganda.
Natia Seskuria, Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute and Founder Executive Director of the Regional Institute for Security Studies. As always, thank you for joining us here in France 24. We appreciate your time and your analysis. Thank you, Natia. Pleasure to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.